best we can. Each man must do his bit.
Welcome to another edition of The Public Interest. My name is David Granger, and on this series of programs, we examine matters which are of interest to Guyanese at home and in the diaspora. And in particular, at this time of the year, we look at the question of martyrdom and the relationship between martyrdom and freedom. And of course, the phrase became very popular in 2020 when the question of the murder of George Floyd was prominent not only in the United States, but all around the world. People asked, do Black Lives Matter? And today in Guyana, we must ask whether the martyrs' lives matter, and who are martyrs, and what is martyrdom. These are important questions. Most nations, recognize martyrs. Of course, it's a religious concept, which came from the Christians. The word, I think, comes from a Greek word meaning witness. And the original martyrs were actually apostles who worked with Jesus and maybe suffered death. And of course, in Islam and there are other religions where the word martyrdom is used very freely. But how is it relevant to Guyanese society? And how does one become a martyr? There are certain criteria. And one is that, it is an act of choice. It is not an accident. It's free will that you freely decide on a course of action, which will lead to death. And of course, the loss of life is an important part of martyrdom. That's the second thing, choice and of course death. And also most important is that the martyr dies for a noble cause. Clearly, you can see that martyrdom differs from dying as a result of your own egotism or extremism or heroism or terrorism. Many terrorists blow themselves up, and of course, because of recklessness. So martyrdom is very clearly defined. Not everybody is a martyr, but certainly a person who makes a choice and who loses his or her life because of a cause. So death by disease, traffic accident, natural disaster, people die from leptospirosis during the flood, or death by suicide, or death from stupidity, it cannot be considered as grounds for declaring a person a martyr. In Guyana, we speak very loosely about martyrs, and what I regard as the best example, maybe the epitome, if you want to call it that, of martyrdom is the martyrdom of the Guyanese who died on the 20th of August, 1823, almost exactly 200 years ago. This year in Guyana, we should be commemorating the 200th anniversary of the slaughter of more than 200 martyrs by the British Army on the morning of 20th of August. We won't go into details about that slaughter, but we know that that is the worst massacre in the history of British Guyana as it was then, and Guyana as we are now, on the 20th of August. So this year is the bicentenary. Let's see what happens. But certainly the Emancipation Foundation, to which I belong, will be observing that anniversary. And I think also the local chapter of the International Decade of People of African Descent have already signaled their intention to mark that anniversary. The Demerara martyrs, therefore, definitely contributed to the emancipation of enslaved Africans, not only in Guyana, but also in the Caribbean, the British Caribbean. They contributed to the eradication of the system of slavery throughout the Americas, and they contributed to the enjoyment of freedom today. And when you read the story of the Demerara Revolt, you'll see that it was a question of choice. These people, nearly 11,000 of them, without cell phones, without modern communications, came all the way from East Coast, and many of them were shot to death at what is now Bachelor's Adventure. They came along the coast and they marched, and they were planning to march to Georgetown. So it was deliberate as a choice because they felt that their freedom was in jeopardy and the freedom was being withheld from them by the planters. So they knew they would be shot at, and even when they started to be shot at, many of them chose to die because they felt they were dying for freedom. It wasn't suicide, it wasn't recklessness, it was an act of choice. And it was for a noble cause of freedom. And that is the freedom that all Guyanese, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of where we came from, enjoy that freedom today. So we see from the start there's a relationship between martyrdom and freedom. That this freedom was purchased at a high price, the price of human lives. And if you look at the world, all around the world, particularly the southern countries in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, any empire, any kingdom is inherently oppressive. Empires are based on oppression. Empires are not, consultative democracies. They are oppressive. And as long as there is oppression, there will be instability. So invariably, not only are empires and kingdoms, and kingdom is really a monarchy, a country that's ruled by a single ruler. Not only are they oppressive, but they're unstable because oppressive countries, oppressive governments create instability and colonize people, and we were a colony up to 1966, tend to suffer economic, ethnic, political, and social pressure. Once there is oppression, there will be resistance. And the martyrs are the ones who resolved of their own free will to resist that oppression. And there we have the origin, or the roots of martyrdom. In martyrdom, therefore, my friends, you saw the protests which came out of the colonial era. And these protests erupted to resist the abuses. And most of those abuses were being perpetrated against the rural and urban poor by the ruling class. Civil unrest in the colonial era was the result of resistance to economic exploitation, the resistance to political domination, the resistance to social segregation. Maybe many of you, either in the diaspora at home, are not aware of what life was like on the British Guiana. There was no bed of roses. Social segregation did exist. There were places where ordinary Guyanese, particularly colored Guyanese, could not go. There were certain clubs they could not go to. There was domination. Don't forget, it was exactly 60 years ago, 70 years ago that we had the first election in which ordinary people were allowed to vote. It was called universal adult suffrage. So before that, most people did not vote, could not vote in elections. So there we have it. Colonial society was oppressive. And as a result of that, unfair employment practices, unfair or unemployment, unfair wages, and unfair treatment by managers. All of these were grounds for resistance, and sometimes that resistance was suppressed cruelly and bloodily. But when we look at so-called martyrdom in the colonial era, are we using martyrdom? Are we cheapening the currency of martyrdom, the value of martyrdom? Is it worthwhile calling somebody a martyr if that person, died accidentally? Let's look at some of the people we refer to as martyrs very briefly, not exhaustively. But Many of us at school would have read about the Demerara martyr. Who was the Demerara martyr? He was a Christian minister, and he died of disease in the Georgetown prison. And he's not the only person to die of disease in the Georgetown prison. But he died for his alleged instigation of the Demerara revolt. Now, any student of history know that John Smith did not instigate the revolt. He did not lead the revolt. In fact, he distanced himself from the revolt. But he goes by the name of the Demerara martyr, which is, I don't think he qualifies. And I'm sure many students of history like myself, I don't call myself a historian, but I don't think any historian will feel that John Smith was a martyr. And the fact that he died of disease, perhaps his death did trigger some reaction in London because he's a white man dying, being accused of leading black people. Simple as that. But certainly he was not the leader and the instigator of the Demerara revolt, but the Demerara martyr. And earlier this year, we had a celebration of the Rose Hall martyrs. Again, 15 workers were shot by armed police. And what is often not said is that those workers were rioting and they actually killed a police corporal and injured several policemen. So depending on which side of the gun you were standing, where you're holding the gun or being shot at, there was an inquiry, and I'm not attempting to say that the shooting was justified. But 15 people at one go is something of a massacre. But are they martyrs? Are the persons who were shot at Rose Hall in 1913, those 15 workers, are they martyrs? And then we have the Enmo martyrs, and of course on the 16th of June, the PPP mainly celebrates the Enmo martyrs. And few people know what happened. They can tell you about the politicians, taking an oath and promising and swearing, to avenge the deaths. But quite frankly, what were the circumstances of the shooting? Not the strike, whether it's cut and drop or cut and load, but how did they come to be shot? Did they rush the police who were armed and protecting a certain installation? Many people don't explain those details, but we go along with the idea that the 5 workers who were shot are in fact martyrs. Did they choose to put their lives on the line? Were they fighting for a noble cause? And is it a matter of recklessness? We don't go into those details. We just accept things on face value, that these people are martyrs. And of course, a little more recently, this is outside of the colonial period, we had the ballot box martyrs. 2 young people were shot when they tried to grab the ballot boxes from soldiers who were instructed to protect those ballot boxes. But we won't go into details. Later on, perhaps, we can look at those martyrs. The question I'm getting at, or the answer that I'm seeking, is how do you judge whether a person is a martyr? If he or she dies by accident or by reckless behavior. And we must be careful how we use these terms. I don't want to deprive anybody of the title of martyr, a national martyr, but we don't want to create ethnic categories in which only one set of people celebrate Enmo martyrs and another set of people celebrate Demerara martyrs. I think martyrdom is a question for all Guyanese, because it's not a question of equality, but all ethnic groups have fought and struggled and maybe died to give us the freedom which we enjoy today. When we speak of martyrdom in the colonial period particularly, and martyrdom comes easily in the United Kingdom. If you go to India, if you go to other countries, in Africa as well, Asia, once the United Kingdom was there, you're going to get martyrdom because they go together. You know, the United Kingdom and oppression and martyrdom. In the plantation system, um, both in the time of enslavement, because the Demerara martyrs were shot during the period of enslavement in 1823, and it's only 15 years later that the enslaved Africans were given their freedom through emancipation. And throughout the colonial period, we don't want to go all the way back to 1763 and different riots and revolts on the plantation. But even if we look at the later colonial period, you'd see that violence plagued the entire sugar belt. Starting from Region 2, well, sugar is almost completely disappeared now. But don't forget, Damon in 1834 was arrested at what is called the Bell Alliance, to use the Guyanese pronunciation. And he's executed outside the public buildings in Georgetown. Is he a martyr? Is he the Essequibo martyr? Nobody refers to him as the Essequibo martyr. There's a monument there at Regina. Of course, the revolt was not launched at Regina. It was launched some distance away. But is Damon the Essequibo martyr? So we had revolts in Region 2, the Pomeroon Supinam. We had in Region 3, the Essequibo Islands, West Demerara. We had in Region 4, Demerara, Essequibo. We had in Region 5, Mayaca, Borbis. We had in Region 6. So throughout the sugar belt, there were riots. And mostly these riots were by workers, working people, who were poor, and very frequently they had disputes concerning working conditions and pay. But in the post-war period, that is directly after the First World War in 1918 and after the Second World War, 1945, the economies of the kingdom, the United Kingdom, and some other countries were depressed. And this depression was translated into harsh conditions in the colonies, especially the British colonies in the West Indies. So post-World War I and post-World War II, we had depression, and once those depressions afflicted the countries, the workers tended to suffer. So there were protests. There were protests in not only after those wars, but also throughout the colonial period. And those protests were usually suppressed by armed policemen and soldiers. And in Guyana particularly, and we'll deal with Guyana, and it sounds like a long catalog, but bear with me for a while, because some of you may be living in different parts of the country, and you might be aware in 1872, there's a riot at Devonshire Castle in Region 2 where 5 workers were killed. In 1856 at Nampere in East Demerara, 5 were killed. At Friends, there was a riot in which 8 persons were killed in 1903. In Georgetown, in Rhymeville particularly, in 1905. And this is a very important revolt, if you want to call it that. 7 persons were killed in 1905. In Rose Hall, Kanji, that's East Kanji. 15 were killed in 1913. And more people were killed in Rose Hall than were killed at Enmore, but few people speak about Rose Hall. But they speak about the 5 at Enmore. That's not a matter. Again at Rhymeveld in 1924, 13 workers were shot dead. 13. Again, 8 more than Enmore. Nobody speaks about Rhymeveld. Leonora in 1939, 4 were killed. Enmore, and then Enmore, which has given us the Enmore martyrs. 5 were killed and 9 were injured. So if you look at the entire sugar belt during the colonial period, even the late colonial period in the 20th century, you'll see that a lot of workers were killed. do all of them fit satisfy the criteria for being called martyrs? No. Let us look particularly at 1905 Rhinefeldt riot. The unintended consequence of that riot was that Hubert Critchlow got dismissed, and he set up the first union in Guyana in 1970, the BGLU. So you can say that the unintended consequence of the shootings, of the massacre of people in the Rhinefeldt in 1905 was the formation of trade unions which continued to struggle and contributed most to the independence of Guyana. So that is what happened. Many people try to attribute the liberation of the working class people to other disturbances, but it was the Rhinefeldt riot of 1905. After that, we had the formation of the BGWL, the British Guiana Workers' League, which I think was later, replaced by the NACI. I think NACI might have been a successor. Then you had the MPCA, the Manpower Citizens Association, which was formed in 1937, mostly for sugar workers. And of course, the more famous Guyana Industrial Workers Union, which is the parent of the GAWU, but it was founded by Dr. Joseph Prayag Lachman Singh, who became the first elected chairman of the People's National Congress. So when you hear about, Enmo Martyr's Day, his name is hardly mentioned, not because he was the founder. He saw the strike through, but later on he became chairman of the PNC, so people don't speak about him. And you know who the general secretary of the GIW? Jane Phillips Gay. But again, you don't hear about that. You hear about after the riot, after the shooting, you heard about the other politicians who did not conduct the riot itself or conduct the strike. But let's not go there now. What we found is that one of the greatest impetus to change was actually something called the labor rebellion throughout the West Indies. And this is a rebellion that affected all of the workers in Belize and Bahamas, in Barbados, in Trinidad, in Grenada, Guyana. And as historians like to say, even Barbados had riots. Normally Barbados is not associated with riotous behavior. But it was the labor rebellion, which came during the Depression in the 1930s. The Great Depression of America had a knock-on effect. The post-World War I Depression had a knock-on effect. And it was that labor rebellion more than anything else, not the Enmore riots, the labor rebellion in the West Indies, which prompted the United Kingdom government to establish the Royal Commission. UK government is good with royal commissions. But when the commission investigated the condition under which West Indian workers were working, the British government, as you expect the British government to do, withheld the publication of the report until after the war ended, because the British government was convinced that if the Nazi German government got hold of it, there would be greater turmoil in the West Indies. So there was no publication of that report until the Germans were well and truly beaten. But nevertheless, there was change. And the change that came after the labor rebellion in the Caribbean is largely the result of the struggles and the death of Caribbean workers. We now come to the point, my friends, at which we ask ourselves, how did martyrdom impact our freedom? And I would say that the historical significance of martyrs' deaths has been underestimated, maybe misunderstood. Certainly, the present administration ignores, some of the struggles of martyrs who, well, I don't know why they ignore. You have to ask them why they ignore. But what I'd say is that when I was in government, I proclaimed several martyrs' days, and the 20th of August is Demerara Martyrs' Day. And I hope that you all listening will observe the 20th of August, the 200th anniversary of the Demerara Revolt, as Demerara Martyrs' Day. And it is gazetted. I took the trouble to ensure it is gazetted. So it is not just another whim, it is a gazetted observance. And we need to pay attention to the historical lessons of martyrdom, which is what I've been speaking about in this program. Martyrdom is useful. It would help the nation to recognize that our ancestors' sacrifices to attain freedom were substantial, and that we must recognize that freedom did just drop from the sky. It wasn't a gift of Queen Victoria. People fought and died for the freedom that we enjoy today. And we must recognize that this freedom was earned by the blood of our martyrs, the sacrifice of our martyrs. Many of them chose to confront British Army guns so that their children could be free. That is historical fact. Secondly, we must remember that freedom is not a favor, from the gracious Queen. It is something that people fought and died for. And it is ours to own, to possess. Third, we must respect that there is a common desire for freedom. It doesn't belong to one group. And, sort of give the impression that other groups were collaborators. Freedom belongs to all of us. It's a common need, a necessity. And we all struggle. Amerindian, African, Chinese, Portuguese, mixed persons, Indians, all struggle for freedom. And if we respect each other, that struggle would be reflected in a more cohesive society. So we should not use, Martyrs' Days to divide the country. Okay, Demerara martyrs belong to all of us. They fought for freedom for everyone. Enmo martyrs belong to all of us because they fought for freedom. Rose Hall martyrs belong to everyone because they fought for freedom, not just for sugar workers or themselves or their families, but for all Guyanese. And we must remember to recognize our ancestors' struggle, to remember that freedom is not a gift, and to respect other people's struggles. Sometimes there is a clear indication that other people's struggles are being sidelined, and that this event belongs to one particular group. That is not so. I hope in this program I've been able to show you that people in the Caribbean as well, and throughout the country, have contributed to the freedom that we enjoy. My friends, it is my considered view that martyrdom, which is a characteristic of life under the United Kingdom, has been and can be a powerfully motivating force for social cohesion. The martyrs of whom I speak courageously confronted colonizers, and they consciously gave their lives. They went into these conflicts, understanding that they could be killed. And they knew that their sacrifice would consciously would contribute to the achievement of a good life for their children and grandchildren, a good life for posterity, a good life for all Guyanese. Thank you, and may God bless you.
life together. See we do it right together. Can we do it? Yes, we can.
Each man must